Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy and the modern world, moving into the reign of the 255th Pope, Pius IX, who reigned from 1846 to 1878. The conclave of 1846 met 57 years after the French Revolution began in 1789. It was the first conclave which had a substantial number of cardinals who had no adult memories of the horrors of the Revolution and the wars that followed. Prominent in the thoughts of the cardinals was the role of the Papal States in the modern world. The Ultramontanes, the Zelanti, the pro-Papal party, favored continuation of the papal monarchy and feudalism, which had been the policy of Pope Gregory XVI, the Pope who just died. The cardinals of that mindset favored Pope Gregory's Secretary of State, Cardinal Luigi Lambruscini, whereas the liberals, the progressives, whatever, were tired of being marginalized in world affairs and embarrassed at the perpetuation of feudalism in the Papal State, at a time when some Protestant countries, such as England, had already abolished feudalism by outlawing serfdom, abolishing serfdom, meaning serfs were no longer legally tied to the land, and feudalism is all built on that. So once that's outlawed, then feudalism collapses. Cardinals of that mindset favored Tommaso Bernetti, who had served as Pro-Secretary of State under Pope Leo XII. Cardinal Lambruscini, the Ultramontane, the conservative, as we'd say today, received a majority of the votes, or I should say a plurality of the votes in the early ballots, but not enough for election. Cardinal Bernetti learned from private sources that the Austrian Archbishop of Milan was on his way to the conclave to interfere in the election on behalf of the Habsburg Empire. So Bernetti convinced his supporters, to realizing he was not going to get enough to be elected, he convinced his supporters to switch and instead support the Cardinal Archbishop of Imola, Giovanni Maria Mastai Ferretti, and persuade others to do the same. Faced with a deadlock between Bernetti and Lambruscini, and with both factions realizing that they did not have enough votes to get their guy elected, enough from both sides instead supported Ferretti. So on the second day of the conclave, June 16th, 1846, on the 11th ballot, on the evening ballot, which was the fourth ballot, Ferretti was elected and received four more votes, like four votes over the 2/3. So baptized Giovanni Mastai, Mastai Ferretti, Ferretti. Coincidentally, Ferretti was one of the scrutineers tabulating the votes on that fourth ballot. He became emotional when the math indicated he was going to be elected. He asked to be excused from his role as scrutineer, but was not permitted to do so, as that would have invalidated the ballot. As a result, Mastai Ferretti had the rare experience of proclaiming his own election as Pope 255. He ruled for the longest pontificate in modern history, 32 years. His baptismal name, Giovanni, was John, so he could have been another Pope John, but he didn't. Instead, he reigned as Pope Pius IX, the second longest reign in all of papal history, St. Peter being the longest. Born into the Italian nobility in the March of Ancona. That's on the Adriatic, on the eastern coast of Italy. Born on May 13th, 1792. He was the younger son of a count. Giovanni was born in the year the Reign of Terror began in Paris. So for him, the French Revolution was something studied in history books rather than a nightmare he lived through, much as World War II has become for most of us. After studies in Viterbo, minor seminary in Viterbo, major seminary in Rome, he was ordained a priest in 1819. As a priest, he had diplomatic experience, having served on a mission to Chile for 2 years, and then returned to the Papal State, where he was put in charge of a hospital of San Michele in Rome for another 2 years. He then was ordained a bishop and was installed as Archbishop of Spoleto for 5 years, and then Bishop of Imola in the Romagna for 8 years, until being admitted to the College of Cardinals in 1840, and he remained Bishop of Imola, and it was in that capacity that he attended the conclave. He was known to be an Italian patriot and to be friendly to the movement of unification of Italy, ending the partition of the peninsula into multiple political jurisdictions, some of which were controlled by non-Italians. He was also known to be personal friends with many prominent political liberals, and to be in favor of relaxation of papal governance of the Papal State. Perhaps, to the point of eliminating serfdom. He would not have eliminated aristocracy, even in his liberal period, but he would have. He was open to eliminating serfdom. So at the time of his election, Pius IX was greeted with a wild outburst of enthusiasm from all classes and all political persuasions, as they believed that at last the repressive reigns, as the liberals regarded it, of Popes Gregory XII and Leo XII and Gregory XVI was finally over. So in Italy, it was during Pius's reign that Italy would be unified and the Papal States would come to an end. So I'll summarize the political factions at the time. Initially, he was aligned with the moderate pro-papal federalist, sort of, which introduces us to a priest named Vincenzo Gioberti, Gioberti, lived from 1801 to 1852. He was a priest in the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, Savoy, which is northwestern Italy. Piedmont had a long history, being designated as a county in the Holy Roman Empire under House Sabaudia. Later, that was contracted and euphanized to Savoy. So the House of Savoy was the House of Sabaudia. It was located in the extreme northwest of Italy, bordering Switzerland and France. In 1416, it was elevated to the rank of a duchy under Amadeus VIII. In 1720, the Duke of Savoy was on the winning side in the War of the Spanish Succession, so was rewarded by receiving the Kingdom of Sardinia. Sardinia is an island on the western side of Italy in the Mediterranean. Because the House Sabaudia was the oldest surviving Italian dynasty still ruling a part of Italy in the mid-19th century, it naturally became the focus of Italian nationalist aspirations for unity in the 19th century, at least among those Italian nationalists who favored a monarchy as a form of government. Father Vincenzo Gioberti was both one of those nationalists, one of those types of nationalists, as well as an ardent Platonist in terms of philosophy. He believed that a correct strategy for unifying Italy could serve as a potent moral force to rescue all of modern society from its spiral into oblivion. Garibaldi was born in Turin, where the Shroud of Turin is, in 1801. Was ordained a priest in 1825. He became a well-known writer promoting Italian unification. He became chaplain to King Charles Albert of Piedmont in 1831, and entering active politics while still a priest, served as president of the Chamber of Deputies for a time, and that's analogous to our Speaker of the House, although, well, not exactly, because it was a parliamentary system. So, but anyway, it analogous, even though our system obviously is not a monarchy or a parliamentary system, but it was, and the point being that it was a prestigious, public political position that he held while still being a priest. He remained in that position until the king appointed him as ambassador to Paris. He died suddenly of a stroke in 1852, but before his death, he articulated a coherent body of thought that was published in writing that represents one of the competing political theologies of the mid-19th century. His starting point was basic Catholic ontology. Ontos is being, so ontology is a theology of being, with the nature of existence. That God is the only original being existing from eternity, the uncreated, the Trinitarian God, who has the omnipotence to create other being ex nihilo, out of nothing. One of those acts of creation is the church, which exists as a reality in the mind of God, and not just in its human institutional manifestation. That's why church buildings can come and go, dioceses can come and go, parishes can come and go, but the church, in that sense, the theological sense, remains. This divinely instituted church exists in continuity throughout history because of the divinely ordained Petrine ministry of the papacy, meaning the unique role of St. Peter and his successors as popes. There is a unique bond, Garibaldi asserted, between the papacy and Italy. Italy and the papacy had renewed Western civilization when it was on the verge of extinction more than once. Ancient Rome, medieval monasticism, the Papal Renaissance, and the Baroque period, the Counter-Reformation. Garibaldi believed that another of those times of necessary renewal of civilization was at hand in his lifetime, when the papacy and Italy must once again act together to avert a relapse into the neo-barbarism of modernism, of atheist modernism. The solution he proposed was for Italy, was nationalist in the sense that Italy to be ruled by the Italians, unified and ruled by Italians, specifically in the construct of a federal union of internally independent sovereignties, but all ruled by Italians. So the federation would be united under the papacy. So the Pope would be the head of state of the federation, but internally each constituent member would handle its own governance. But Italy would be united with the Pope as the head of state, while the Pope would retain internal governance of his own piece, the papal state. Garibaldi concluded that this new creation would, and should represent a moral force in the world, rooted in proper ontology, rooted in proper theology of being, as well as subordinated to a correct metaphysics, a theology of the supernatural, which would serve as a model for the regeneration of Europe. It would provide an alternative to the other what existed at his time. On one side, the repressive monarchical police states, or on the other side, the rabid atheist governments promoted by communist and radical socialists. It was Pope Pius IX, well, at the time, Bishop Mestai Ferretti's personal friendship with this guy, Garibaldi, as well as his possession of many well-thumbed copies of Garibaldi's works, which gave him the reputation of being a moderate liberal. And in truth, Garibaldi's ideas did appeal to him. He was an Italian, he was an Italian patriot, as well as a man who loved the church. So he liked that idea of bringing those two together. Now, in the end, of course, Garibaldi's ideas were just too idealistic and were not actionable, given how far modernism had already infected and blighted the modern world by the mid-19th century. Nevertheless, Garibaldi's works were bestsellers in Italy, and his articles and pamphlets were reprinted and translated into English, German, and French, so his ideas were well known. And his opus, his magnum opus, was a 3-volume work titled Introduction to the Study of Philosophy, published in installments, 1839 and 1840. A second faction, so to speak, were revolutionary, anti-papal secularist, which introduces us to the two Giuseppes, Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe, what's his name? Garibaldi. Mazzini was the oldest, so we'll cover him first. Giuseppe and Mazzini, Mazzini. Mazzini was born in Genoa, and then at the time of his birth in 1805, it was part of the Ligurian Republic under the rule of Napoleon's empire. His father, Giacomo, was a university professor with a Jacobin political ideology of the French Revolutionary version. So that's how he, could have a job when that part of Italy was controlled by the French. His mother's name was Maria. She was a Jansenist in terms of political theology. As he grew, Giuseppe Mazzini proved to be an excellent student, interested in both literature and politics. He became a lawyer in 1826, functioning as what we would today describe as a public defender. Privately, he published essays on literature and articles for political journals. His first essay, published in 1827, was a combination of both literature and politics, titled On Dante's Patriotic Love. In terms of political journalism and public agitation, Mazzini wrote for a newspaper in Genoa until it was closed by the police. Napoleon, Waterloo was 1815, and then, of course, all the parts of Europe that Napoleon had conquered became, free again, and so by this point, by Mazzini's adulthood, actually when he was 10 years old, Waterloo happened when he was 10. So by the time he was an adult, his Genoa, where he was living, was part of the revived Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, Savoy. And there was a reaction, the conservative, reaction against any revolutionary ideology. So that newspaper was closed by the police in service of the Kingdom of Savoy. That was Mazzini's first personal experience of political expression being suppressed by arbitrary government coercion, and solidified his anti-authoritarianism from abstractions, philosophical abstractions imbibed from his father, into a life's pursuit of liberty for his fellow Italians by public action. To this end, in 1827, he joined the Carbonari, which was the Italian version of Freemasonry. It was a secret society organized to overthrow the existing order in Italy and replace it with a unified Italy under Italian rule, but under a secular government, a non-monarchical, a republic, essentially, a secular republic. On October 31st, 1827, Mazzini, along with some other Carbonari, were captured by the Polizia Segreta, the secret police of the Kingdom of Savoy, and they were put in prison in Savona. In 1831, Mazzini escaped prison, fleeing to Geneva, Switzerland. 4 years. So he had spent 4 years as a political prisoner, and that only magnified his hatred of the existing system of monarchy. Networking with other Italian exiles in Switzerland, as well as southern France, Mazzini created a new organization called Young Italy, La Giovane Italia, in June of 1831, openly advocating violence now, after 4 years in prison. So now he's openly advocating violence to change the government to overthrow the monarchy. And La Giovane Italia, the Young Italy, promoted Italian unification under the slogan, "One free, independent republic," with the another slogan being "Union, Strength, and Liberty." So it's an Italian reformulation of his father's French Jacobin ideology: liberty, equality, fraternity. So because of the Italian situation, it was union, strength, and liberty. So Mazzini moved. His first murder as a revolutionary was committed in 1833, organizing a revolution in northern Italy, using branches of Young Italy in Genoa, Alessandria, and Turin. The Segreta, the secret police, discovered the plot, arrested many agitators, and executing 12 of them. Mazzini escaped, but the prisoners who were captured under torture, they divulged his identity as their leader. So he was tried and sentenced to death in absentia, meaning he could be shot on sight. Undeterred, Mazzini organized another revolution in 1834. This introduces us to the second Giuseppe Garibaldi, Garibaldi. Garibaldi was born, Joseph on July 4th, 1807, born in Nice, which is spelled nice, but it's on the Mediterranean coast. It had changed hands many times in history. On today's maps, that city is 8 miles from the Principality of Monaco and 19 miles from the border between France and Italy. And on today's maps, it's on the French side. But at the time of Garibaldi's birth, in 1807, it was part of Napoleon's empire. That part of, had been conquered in 1792. But after Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the Congress of Vienna returned Nice, revived the existence of the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, Savoy, and returned Nice to Piedmont, then governed by King Victor Emmanuel I. Garibaldi was age 7. So both Garibaldi and Mazzini Mazzini was 3 years older, so then, I mean, they were both born in Napoleon's empire, and then when they were children, Garibaldi was 7, Mazzini was 10. Then they both were citizens of the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, Savoy, although on opposite sides of the Italian Alps. Mazzini was on the Genoa side, and Garibaldi was on the Nice, the Mediterranean side. They also were from different classes. Mazzini was born into the professional class, as his father was a professor. Garibaldi was born into the working class. And along with most working class boys of his area, they sought their living on the sea. They lived on the coast. In 1832, Garibaldi obtained certification as a captain in what was their analog of our merchant marine. In April of 1833, he had a life-changing encounter with a member of Young Italy, Mazzini's group. Now, it wasn't Mazzini yet. They would eventually meet, but the one who sort of turned him to the dark side, to the revolutionary side, was Giovanni Battista Cuneo, C-U-N-E-O, whose passion for Italian unification as a secular republic instead of a monarchy captivated Garibaldi's imagination. So Garibaldi joined Young Italy, dedicated himself to freeing Italy from foreign domination by Austrians and French, and then further pursuing unification of all of Italy under Italians, under a republic. 7 months later, in November of 1833, the two Giuseppes met. Garibaldi met Mazzini. And under Mazzini's tutelage, Garibaldi joined the Carbonari, embracing the necessity of revolutionary violence to achieve the goal of Italian reunification and nationalism. So this catches us up to Mazzini's story. Exiled after his first failed revolution in 1833, in February 1834, Garibaldi joined Young Italy and the Carbonari in Mazzini's second organized revolution in Piedmont, the Kingdom of Piedmont. And in this case, the army, and the previous one, the Segreta, the secret police of the kingdom, it caught him and stopped it first. But in this case, the revolution actually did actually start. The violence did start. And so the army was required to put it down. And in this case, the army remained loyal to the king of Piedmont and crushed the revolution. The two Giuseppes escaped, abandoning their followers, some of them to long imprisonment for life in some cases, others to execution. Mazzini spent years on the run, first to Switzerland, then to France, then to England, where he settled in 1837. There, like the later Karl Marx, he took advantage of English tolerance, the laws, the tolerant English publishing laws, to organize more violence. So that, to this end, he created a network of Young Italy clones in multiple countries. So he founded Young Poland, Young Germany, Young France, etc. And when he had established these cells, these revolutionary cells in other countries, then he united them under the aegis of Giovani Europa, Young Europe, with its base at Bern in Switzerland. And Young Europe, claimed that its allegiance was to the transnational ideals of liberty, equality, and humanity. Meanwhile, Garibaldi, after the failure of the 1834 revolution, he fled too, but he went in another direction. Garibaldi came to the Americas, settling first in South America. He brought Young Italy, that revolutionary ethos, to South America. He served as an itinerant revolutionary leader, guerrilla leader, And it's in this context that word appears. Now, not guerrilla like Gorilla, but guerrilla, Guerrilla. So guerre is the French word for war. So guerrilla means little war. Small, meaning small units of revolutionaries, of subversives, whatever you want to call them, enacting violence, rather than an army, millions of troops like the World War II. Guerrilla warfare is small scale. It can do a lot of damage. It's asymmetric in the sense that small groups acting clandestinely can cause a great deal of damage and can survive, and can actually win. As subsequent history taught us, can actually win against larger, better armed, wealthier systems. So he became an itinerant guerrilla revolutionary leader, first against the Empire of Brazil, which was part of the Portuguese Empire at this point, from 1835 to 1839, Garibaldi waged guerrilla war against them, seeking to overthrow the monarchy in favor of a secular and atheist republic. It failed. This revolution failed. He escaped. He then moved on to Uruguay, where he married, and he organized his later well-known, famous revolutionary horde called the Red Shirts. From 1842 to 1848, he involved himself and them and the Red Shirts in a civil war in Uruguay on the side of the Reds, the communists, against the military. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Mazzini continued fomenting revolution. He fomented more uprisings. Now, in these cases, it was riots, really, that he hoped would grow into revolution, but instead there were just riots that resulted in, deaths and arson. And most of the people who died were innocent. Just all of a sudden a riot, erupts, and then people go into the market, get caught in the middle. But he did it again and again. He did it on the island of Sicily. He did it in Tuscany. He did it in Lombardy between 1837 and 1840, so one a year. Now, they failed to explode into full-scale revolution, but they did generate rioting, property damage, injuries, and death, which is contributed to this atmosphere of instability, chaos, fear, and the sense that among people who just wanted to live in peace, the sense that the government, the established government, wasn't doing the job. They couldn't do it. They couldn't keep the peace, couldn't protect them. In 1843, he tried again in Bologna. It also remained at the level of rioting. Then later the same year, 1843, two of his young Italy minions, they were brothers, Attilio and Emilio Bandiera, tried on their own. They organized another revolution in the south of Italy, in the Kingdom of Naples, at Cosenza. But there, the Segreta intercepted Mazzini's correspondence with them. The Bandiera brothers were members of the Austrian Navy, so they were Italian. But as we saw for many reasons, historic reasons, for centuries, whole parts of Italy were actually controlled by the Austrians, which is one of the things that set off this movement of Italian nationalism. So there were many, even though they were Italian, and born in Italy, they were actually born under Austrian jurisdiction, and so it was essentially a colony of Austria. And as many young men in that situation, they have limited opportunities, so they go in the military. And this shows us, through their life, shows us how this revolutionary ethos, how it can spread. Working on young men like this, who were dissatisfied, they went into the military, not the Italian military, they went into the Austrian military because they didn't have much of a choice. Their careers were always limited because they were Italian. They would never become high-ranking officers, so their officers were always going to be Austrian. And so people like Mazzini and their minions, they interact with people like this in the bar room or wherever. And the communists even call it that raising, politically activate. That's it, politically activate people like this, raising their revolutionary consciousness by convincing them, working on their feelings of dissatisfaction, discontentment, and injustice. To the point, that while these guys are accepting their salary and living from the Austrian Navy, they actively work against their employers for revolutionary reasons. So these guys were captured in the midst of the public violence, and their military status deprived them of any consideration. So even though they were Italian, but they were members of the Austrian Navy, and they were citizens of Austrian territory, even though it was Italian. So they were considered, they were executed for treason. While Mazzini remained safe in Great Britain, availing himself of the public freedoms in Great Britain to get other people in trouble like this. So between them, the two Giuseppes, Mazzini and Garibaldi, developed an international web of contacts, as well as a reputation as leaders of a movement willing to resort to anything, up to and including violence and murder, to reverse the restoration of monarchy by the Congress of Vienna in 1815 after the defeat of Napoleon and the dismantling of Napoleon's empire. Manifesting in distinct ways in each country, this post-Napoleonic revival of the revolutionary ethos all shared contempt for hereditary aristocracy, resentment of monarchy, hereditary monarchy, and shared idealized fantasies of that the slogans of the first French Revolution were actually serious and had actually ever been actionable, and that they could be translated into concrete replacements for hereditary monarchy and hereditary aristocracy. Replacements that would not degenerate into military dictatorships, as the French Revolution had degenerated into dictatorship by Napoleon. Even though Napoleon called it an empire, I mean, it was a military dictatorship. So all of this was the situation of the two Mazzinis and their revolutionary movement at the time Pius IX was elected in 1846. Both of the two Giuseppes, wrote to the new pope. Mazzini from London, Garibaldi from South America, believing that Pius IX's prior association with Gioberti would make him amenable, not to the violence, but at least amenable to helping with the movement of Italian unification under the control of Italians. Now, as we'll see, when the Pope did not do what they wanted, they turned against him. So stay tuned. All right, a third faction in all of this maelstrom when Pius IX was elected were anti-papal constitutional monarchists, which introduces us to Camillo Benso, B-E-N-S-O. As a reward for his service, which we'll discuss, he was rewarded with a title of aristocracy, so he's better known by that, the Count de Cavour, C-A-V-O-U-R. He lived from 1810 to 1861. He served as Prime Minister of Piedmont, the Kingdom of Piedmont, which was a constitutional monarchy like England, in the sense that it had a parliament. It had a hereditary monarchy, but it also had a parliament, an elected parliament. And he was Prime Minister. He served as Prime Minister beginning in 1852. And of all the factions, he's the one that succeeded. He was the chief architect, Cavour was the chief architect of Italian unification, the way it actually ended up happening, under the dynasty he served, under the Sabaudia, House Sabaudia, the dynasty that ruled Piedmont, Sardinia, Savoy. Thereby, he became the first prime minister of a united Italy in 1860. Okay, so he was born Camillo Benso in Turin in 1810 to a professional family, non-aristocratic but professional family. He was trained as an engineer. Well, he went into the army, and there he was trained. The army trained him as a military engineer, and then he took that training, returned to civilian life, and made his living initially as an engineer. Traveled extensively in England and France for a combination of work. You know, he paid his way as he went around. He wanted the adventure. You know, a young man wanted to travel around, and he just traded his engineering skills and took work wherever he could. And he was very curious, very a very talented guy. I mean, I have to give him his due. Even though he turned against the church, I have to give him his due. He learned those languages. He became fluent enough to speak and write in English and French, and made some money, enough to be, you know, financially comfortable. So he returned home to the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, Savoy, and decided to get involved in politics, promoting himself publicly as a moderate, non-revolutionary, I mean, not, you know, non-violent, progressive, in the sense of one technological, a technocrat, as we would say today, one who promoted economic improvement through modern technology, such as the railroad. He rejected assertions of the papacy to any right to temporal power, meaning he rejected the papal monarchy over the papal states. But he also rejected, you know, the extreme of the violent revolutionary anarchism of the two Giuseppes. Nevertheless, he was another one. All these factions, what they shared in common was a desire for Italy to be united under Italians. But they all differed on how to get there and what form of government should control a united Italy. In his case, he just wanted to expand. Like he was a citizen of the Kingdom of Piedmont, which was a constitutional monarchy like England, so he just wanted to expand that. He wanted Italy as a single nation, as a constitutional monarchy, under the house he served, under House Sabaudia, with a parliament, you know, with an elected parliament. So he thought it would just be like England. It would have the best of both, that they would have elected representative government that was accountable. So if the people didn't like some policy, tax theft or whatever, then we just vote those guys out. But at the same time, it would have the stability of a hereditary monarchy. Further, unlike England, he favored an idea he got from the United States. He favored complete separation of church and state. So that's a difference from England. England had and still does have an established church, the Anglican Church. The monarch is head of the church, but he didn't want that. He wanted basically England, the English model, but without that, a secular version. In terms of putting this into action, he was more practical than any of the other factions we covered. Very grounded in reality, no doubt, because of his training as an engineer. That, coupled with a persistence, I mean, he was a very resolute type. You know, okay, one thing failed, well, just, you know, try something else. That fails, try something else. So it just it didn't bother him. Like he was just going to keep doing one thing after another, after another, after another, until he either died or succeeded. That enabled him to succeed, where the plans of so many others remained either in the realm of fantasy or degenerated into pointless violence. With this in mind, so he becomes Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Piedmont. During the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, that pitted, Italy actually had, you know, no real, nothing. Okay, so Crimea is a peninsula that sticks, it's in the Black Sea, but sticks up from the north coast, projects into the Black Sea from the north coast of the Black Sea. And so because it's a peninsula, it had a Navy base. And So so the Crimea is on the north of the Black Sea. Directly south are two straits that lead from the Black Sea into a little Sea of Marmara, and then from there there's another strait that leads into the Aegean. And then from the Aegean Sea one can get into the Mediterranean, and from the Mediterranean one can get to the Suez Canal or anywhere else in the Mediterranean. So strategically significant. For that reason, the Crimean War pitted Russia against England and France. Now, Italy really had no actual interest in this. Cavour certainly didn't care what happened to Crimea. But he, as prime minister, sided with England and France, assuming they would win, because that would give Italy a seat at the table in peace negotiations, and would be an escalation of an alliance with England and France that he thought would benefit his kingdom. And England and France did win, and it worked. The strategy worked. This made the other great powers, at least England and France, sympathetic to his domestic initiative of uniting Italy under House Sabaudia, under the Kingdom of Piedmont. And that was crucial to his ultimate success. Okay, with all that background, I know that's a lot, but the reign of Pius IX doesn't make sense without understanding all this that he had to deal with. All right, so he's elected. And initially he's a moderate liberal, as we saw. So in his first 2 years, Pope Pius IX did what people thought he would do. He enacted some liberal reforms in the papal state. First, he began with a general amnesty for all those who had been arrested during the reign of Gregory XVI and his suppression of the revolts in 1831, meaning he let these people out of prison. Now, some had been in prison for 15 years, but anyway, so he let them out. He also let it be known he believed that reasonable concessions to those seeking lay involvement in the government of the papal states, meaning turning it into some version of a constitutional monarchy, was desirable, because that would ensure stability by incorporating moderates into positions of leadership. And therefore, something like the English model, obviously not completely, because the Pope, it was, but something like that, meaning an elected parliament, some kind of elected parliament. To this end, Pius appointed a layman who was a count, an Italian count, Pellegrino Rossi, R-O-S-S-I, as the first prime minister of the papal state. Rossi was he lived from 1787 to 1848. He was a lawyer by profession. He was known to be a liberal Catholic in the 19th century meaning of liberal, which we covered earlier. He also had training as an economist. He had taught in Switzerland and in Paris, and was even married to a Swiss Protestant wife. That was scandalous to Catholics in the mid-19th century. In March of 1848, Pius granted a bicameral, meaning a two-house assembly, essentially a parliament, of elected laity from the papal state. And he was moving in the direction of accepting a constitution for the temporal governance of the papal state. A constitution that would recognize in writing, as part of the organic law of the kingdom of the papal state, the unfettered papal sovereignty in spiritual matters. All of these initiatives swell the popularity of Pius in Italy, France, and England, and even the United States. Pope Pius was by nature an optimist who always thought the best of others. Because his own temperament was so open and honest, he just couldn't understand. Like he had no mental category to understand that there were men who despised Catholicism, yet would pretend to love it in order to use the church and manipulate naive clergy like him for political purposes. In other words, Pius IX fell into the same trap that the lower clergy of France fell in 1789 in France, of being manipulated by duplicitous seculars into undermining the strength of the church in the name of progress. Pope Pius did not realize the mistake, the trap he had walked into for 2 years. But eventually it happened. Eventually they turn. People who do this, they turn on the church. And the turn against him occurred in April of 1848, when his new bicameral legislature voted to join the rest of Italy in a war of national liberation against Austria to drive the Austrians out of Italian territory. And Pius was shocked by this. Too late, he saw what he had done. He knew that there was no moral justification for him to wage war on Austria. Austria had not attacked him, had not attacked the papal state. In fact, Austria multiple times in papal history had saved popes personally as well as saved the papal state, including as recently as his own predecessor, Gregory XVI. But, legislatures are made up of individuals with their own ideas, their own ambitions. And he gave him the vote. He gave him a representative vote and told him, okay, this is in terms of temporal matters, you have a vote, and it's going to be like a parliament. And in 1848, they wanted Austria out of Italy. So the Pope, now he had empowered, in the name of liberalism and progress, he had created and empowered this parliament and said he was going to listen to him, give him their, control of the secular government. So here is a matter of secular government, waging war. But he said no, absolutely refused. Austria has not attacked us. So, we, as a papal state, have no grounds for war against Austria. So then they turned on him instantly, as quickly as the crowds turned against Christ. Overnight, Pius was recast in the media of the world, the newspapers of the world, as a benighted medieval despot who was shackling Italy to a long-dead feudal past. Same year, 1848. As mentioned in the last reign, because it started in the last reign, a fungus blighted the potato crop of Ireland in 1845, and it spread across Europe. But it's called the Irish potato famine because the Irish were more dependent domestically. The potato was a more important staple food at the time for the Irish than it was for the rest of Europe. It affected the rest of Europe. The potato was eaten in other places, so it did affect everyone. But other places had a more diversified agriculture. So it did not kill, the millions, literally, that it killed in Ireland. Anyway, that blight started in 1845 in the last papal reign. This coincided with a European-wide economic depression that left millions unemployed, hungry, angry, desperate. Now, whether or not the connection between the famine and the economic depression was causal or simply parallel is an argument that still goes on in specialized historical journals, but that's outside our parameters. What's significant is they both happened. The famine and the economic depression happened at the same time, affected all of Europe. The historic importance of this convergence is that it triggered a hyperactive publishing cycle, newspapers, pamphlets, magazines, journals, debating the prevailing economic ideologies, which were, one was the mercantile system. Mercantilism means a managed economy under the political construct of monarchy, a monarchical managed economy. That was the system that existed in Austria, Russia, and Spain. Versus the other prevailing existing economic system was merchant capitalism, as practiced in England, Holland, the United States, and some of the German principalities. Following the well-established pattern that had repeated itself since the French Revolution, the extremity of the situation, meaning people who are desperate, fueled radicalism. So there were always a tiny subset of the population that were radical, and always would be. They're not, no matter what, they would not be satisfied. But they only have an opportunity to cause real damage when a situation like this, convergence of the famine with the economic depression, made otherwise moderate people who just wanted to live in peace, but made them desperate. And so then they were radicalized by desperation and therefore easily manipulated by pre-existing radicals who already had developed their own agendas. So it made a larger swath of the population receptive to radical assertions that a replacement system was needed for all of the prevailing systems. Mercantilism, monarchy, capitalism, this all has to go. This impulse revived the ideology of socialism, which we covered earlier in the playlist. Given the appearance of credibility by the apparent collapse of its rivals, because it looked like both mercantilism and capitalism had failed. Now, at the time, socialism, nobody was practicing socialism, so it's convenient. It was this fantasy abstraction. Oh yeah, everybody would have enough, but nobody would have too much. There's just that as opposed to the prevailing system where you had millions of people starving to death. But there was no place to point to and say, yeah, you see it's working there, or see it's failed there. Because in the mid-19th century, nobody was socialist. It was just mercantilism and capitalism, and both appeared unable to cope with the situation. This revival, this mid-19th century revival, combined the utopian socialism of Robert Owen, which we covered earlier, 1813, with the more doctrinaire socialism of Saint-Simon, first published in 1817, who wished to abolish all churches, as well as abolish personal inheritance. So with Saint-Simon, individuals could own things, but when they died, they could not pass that on to their children. Whenever anyone died, it just became the property of the societas, of the people, of the society. Combined with, in the desperation, with the anarchist socialism, published in 1840 by Pierre Joseph Proudhon, who argued much more radically that private property, just the private property itself, is theft. By definition, private ownership of property is theft. Combined with, again because of the desperation, with a homicidal class hatred of the First French Revolution, which degenerated into the Reign of Terror in 1792. So this synthesis of all these pre-existing versions of socialism synthesized into revolutionary socialism, most famously articulated by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, published in this year, February 1848, proclaiming, "Arise, workers! You have nothing to lose but your chains." Karl Heinrich Marx, born on the 5th of May, 1818, in the German Rhineland city of Trier. His father converted from Judaism to Lutheranism, at least officially, because otherwise he would have been unable to practice law, because the Lutheran Church was the established church in Germany. This necessity of conversion for political reasons and economic reasons left a deep impression on baby Karl, on young Karl. It etched into his mind in those early years, the early formative years of his life, the certainty, which he never questioned afterward, that all organized authority structures, both church and state, were intrinsically hypocritical, serving only to legitimize what was in reality the naked exercise of power by those with power over those who have none. His father sent young Karl to the University of Berlin in 1836 to study law. But Karl switched to philosophy, studying philosophy, at first without his father's knowledge. Karl first became enamored with, fascinated with, and then later turned against and became obsessed with refuting the assertions of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Hegel. Hegel had died only 5 years earlier, after spending the last 13 years of his life teaching at that university, University of Berlin. Hegel had attempted to present in his writings, in his philosophical writings and teaching, a unified concept of existence that would clarify the intrinsic unity of logic with faith. Now, he wasn't Catholic, so but it was like Catholics we would say faith and reason, but he's logic and faith. So the natural, meaning natural created by God, with the engineered, the social with the theological, and ultimately the human with the spiritual. That was the goal of his philosophy. He built, or he wrote, he argued, constructed, conceptually, within the framework of a Christianized version of Platonism, of Platonic idealism. And within that framework, he crafted a panoramic equation to explain how the human person and human societies grow. In his conclusion, grow progressively closer to full comprehension of the eternal ideals that shape physical reality. So it's very aspirational, philosophy, very, very positive and optimistic philosophy. He called it dialectical idealism. This equation, and making it an equation, it's very Germanic. This equation looked to history to find the engagement of opposing ideas, which he reduced in the equation to a thesis versus an antithesis. For example, a thesis of absolute monarchy, the antithesis, representative popular democracy. Those two are, in every category, those two are opposites. Yet, with his equation, over time, the interaction of those two elements produced something new, which in Hegel's mind was a higher level of development, constitutional monarchy. And that served, in Hegel's conclusion, to advance the human condition. Initially, Marx was enamored with this idea, the clarity that one could understand history with this, as the terms of these equations. But as he read more, he became profoundly offended by Hegel's idealism and optimism, regarding it as oversimplified and willfully blind to the ongoing exploitation of peasants and workers by all ruling classes in all societies of history, whether hereditary aristocracy, hereditary monarchy, or the merchants in the constitutional monarchy, the industrialists in the constitutional monarchy of England, or the industrial capitalists in the officially secular republic of the United States. It was all of that. Marx believed that earlier philosophers had contented themselves with just interpreting the world, but that the true purpose of philosophy was to change the world. So that this is when the idea of revolution, of actively using philosophy, published philosophy, to instigate direct action and to change governments and change the world. This is when it formed. Now, it didn't move into violence yet, but it's, nothing just happened. So this is years of development that began in his student, time. Or actually began earlier when he was a child. And his father had to pretend, to convert from Judaism to Lutheranism just to get a job. Starting from that mistrust and contempt and assumption of hypocrisy, on the part of, regarding all authority structures, in moving into university and what follows. Okay, in 1841, he left the university to start writing for radical journals and working for extremist groups in Cologne. He was arrested and exiled later that year and relocated to Paris in 1842. There he met the anarchist socialist Pierre Proudhon, whose essay the year before, in 1840, was titled, "What is property? Property is theft." He also met Friedrich Engels, who would become his closest collaborator. 3 years later, 1845, both Marx and Engels were arrested by the French police and exiled from France. So they moved to Belgium. They were living in Brussels when the potato famine, when the fungus blighted the potato crop and spread, and the economic collapse. So they were living in Brussels when that spread all over Europe. And it was there that he published the first version, or he wrote the first version of the Communist Manifesto in February 1848. When the revolutions of 1848 erupted, which we'll discuss in a minute, Marx returned to Germany and organized a revolutionary socialist group called the Rhineland Democratic Congress. He was arrested again, exiled again, this time relocated to London. So like Mazzini, parasiting off of the English and parasiting off of the availing himself, seeking the protections of the law, the freedom of speech that existed there, to undermine exactly that form of government. So that this is just typical of these people. They parasite off of systems that they condemn and want to overthrow. So moved to London, 1849, and he spent the rest of his life there as a parasite, living off of Friedrich Engels. And here's again, Engels' father owned a factory. And so Engels was parasiting off of his father, making money off of his father, and using that money to support Marx and his family, while they were publishing to overthrow exactly that kind of system that made his father's business possible. All right, so Marx wrote up many things, but culminated his magnum opus was a massive 3-volume work titled Das Kapital, the capital in the sense of money, not capital like a city. It was published in installments over 27 years, from 1867 to 1894. That, along with other essays, articles, and things that he produced, formed a corpus of writing that became the primal documents for revolutionary socialism. Because of its long-term effect on world history, revolutionary socialism is usually, to avoid confusion with other forms of socialism, is generally given the separate title of communism because of the Communist Manifesto. And it became and remains a political religion for atheists. Okay, so here's a general summary. The starting point of Marxism is an erroneous anthropology. Anthropology is the philosophy of the human person. So an erroneous understanding of the human person. Marxism denied the existence of an immortal soul because he denied the existence of God. For Marx, and in communist ideology, the human person was strictly a material being, defined as different from lower animals only by our ability to change the natural world through labor. Second, from this erroneous materialist anthropology, Marx constructed an erroneous materialist metaphysics, built around what was, in his mind, an objective formula for analyzing history that was purely material. And ironically, again, the fundamental parasitic, MO of communist is he plagiarized Hegel's methodology, Hegel's equation, but reimagined it. Instead of dialectical idealism, the optimistic, aspirational, Neoplatonic, Christian Platonic Platonism of Hegel, he reformulated as dialectical materialism. These elements, the elements in Marx's equation, were derived from what he termed the laws of production and wages. And seminarians in your notes capitalize. That's a proper noun in the way they use it. Laws of production and wages. These laws gave to his writing, to Marx's writing, the appearance of scientific objectivity and created something completely new in human history, a metaphysics for atheists. I know seminarians, with your philosophical background, you're thinking that that's a contradiction in terms. Metaphysics is a philosophy of understanding that which is beyond the material. So if Marx is just strictly limited to the material, how can he have a metaphysics? So we think that there's nothing, and there's truth to that. However, when I say a metaphysics for atheists, I mean it's an erroneous metaphysics. I see it as a substitute. So instead of an authentic metaphysics, this what I'm about to summarize, the dialectical materialism, fills the vacuum of metaphysics cognitively, in the sense that it gives communists something they can pretend is an objective reality from which they can deduce, they can reason all of their positions. So, Marx's dialectical materialism, summarized as follows. Wealth is derived from control of the means of production and distribution. Functionally, those develop over time, along with technology. So land, animal breeding, ships, then as technology advances, mills, factories, but whatever it is, wealth is derived from control of those means of production and distribution. The power of this control inevitably becomes concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer by means of a process of conflict and oppression. Third, as the group wielding wealth and power becomes smaller and smaller, their tyranny over society becomes more and more abusive. This tyranny proceeds to the point that the numerical majority of the population are pushed by their survival instinct to overthrow the tyrants, to overthrow that tiny minority that controls the means of production and distribution. The result is that they take control of the means of production and distribution. And then the cycle. So this new power group inevitably follows the same pattern of concentration of wealth and power until it becomes oppressive, until the oppression becomes a tyranny, until the tyranny faces revolution and overthrow. And then whoever overthrows it will do the same thing again. So this is dialectical materialism. So this is the substitute for metaphysics for communist. Third, from this synthesis of erroneous anthropology and erroneous pseudo-metaphysics, on that foundation, Marx then constructed an erroneous epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge, how we learn. So denying the existence of objective truth, apart from the laws he asserted, you see that's objectively true. The assertions of religion are false, but his assertions are true. That's another, standard, communist thing. That Marx argued that the natural rulers of society are those who exert the labor needed to alter the material world. So the workers are the natural rulers of society. Their natural rule was stolen from them, Marx believed, by those who do not exert labor, but who do instead have control of the military, of the coercive power to impose their dominance. This group, to masquerade its theft of natural sovereignty, concocts systems of religion or political legitimacy, like hereditary monarchy, to convince those who labor that their servitude is right and just. Therefore, he referred to religion as the opium of the masses, the opium of the people. Central to this means of social control was what Marx termed commodity fetishism. The belief, which is through manipulation of religion and teaching political ideology, is downloaded into the minds of the workers. The belief that commodities produced by workers are in fact more valuable than the workers themselves. Ironically, Marx's denunciation of this, commodity fetishism, is perfectly consistent with church teaching, and is one explanation of why so many Catholic theologians in the 19th and even more in the 20th century were duped into believing that Marxism could be baptized into an effective means of social change. Fourth, the culmination of Marxist analysis was a political assertion. He believed that the concentration of wealth through control of the means of production and distribution in the hands of those who did not actually labor introduced a principle of instability in human history. This instability was and is and always will be unsustainable, and was responsible for all the revolutionary changes that were a regular feature of human history, from hunter-gathering tribes to larger tribal chieftains to hereditary monarchies to parliamentary capitalist republics. He believed that the momentum of his own time, the mid-19th century, was moving toward another cycle of revolutionary change. Revolution in its little, like to revolve means to turn, so turning. So those who were on the bottom will be on the top, a revolution. His personal mission was to raise the awareness of workers to the forces of history, politically activate them, so that instead of the revolution initiating just another cycle, instead, these politically aware workers could create something new, something that would end the cycles, create a dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning the proletariat is all the workers. So where the workers would govern themselves, living in a classless society, without private property, without inherited privilege, without the confusion of superstitious religion, without the exploitation of self-serving governments. Also interesting to note that as Marx presented it, this classless society would be one of material simplicity, without the luxuries produced by capitalism. So everyone would have enough, but no one would have too much. That's, from each according to his ability, to each according to their need. That's the fantasy they thought was going to happen. So this is another element that deluded some 19th and 20th century Catholic theologians into believing that Marxism was at heart Christian, willfully ignoring the intrinsic atheism, he denied the existence of God, as well as its promotion of violent class warfare to achieve this dictatorship of the proletariat and the classless society. Okay, now, back to history. The year that Marx published the Communist Manifesto, 1848, was a year of revolutions, literally. Over 50 major uprisings occurred across Europe, starting in that 1 year. The first being on January 12th in Sicily, on the island of Sicily. Now, each of those revolutions had a different trigger set off by local circumstances, but they did share some elements in common. First, the economic collapse that coincided with the potato famine rendered many otherwise law-abiding citizens desperate and afraid, making them easier to manipulate by radicals, Second, these organized radicals, like Marx, were able to use the already existing resentment of the working class against the repressive police states that had been imposed after Napoleon's overthrow in 1815. This was 33 years later, so an entire generation born after the Napoleonic Wars ended had forgotten or never experienced, because they were too young, the fear of the French Revolution and the generation of wars that followed. Third, the nobility, the aristocracy in general of Europe, were also dissatisfied with the government of the Congress of Vienna system, because it was a form of royal absolutism enforced by a police state, which denied them, the aristocrats, what they believed was their rightful role in society. Fourth, the middle class was also not happy. Even in countries like France, which did allow, or England, which did allow commoners to vote and hold public office, because the vote was based on property ownership, which disenfranchised the lower middle class. Exactly the kind of people who work and pay taxes, but who now were rendered unemployed. Okay. To cover all the details and all, that would take us too far afield. So the results of the revolutions of 1848 as the ones that are relevant for the church. In Austria, Catholic monarchy, the revolution of 1848 forced the abdication of the famous Prince Clemens von Metternich. We covered earlier. He had been the architect of the Austrian foreign policy during at the end of the final coalition wars against Napoleon, and was the intellectual and spiritual father of the Concert of Europe, which came into being after the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Because this Concert of Europe was predicated on military coordination of European monarchies to repress all movements of social change, Metternich was the symbol of reactionary tyranny that all revolutionary radicals despised. The Habsburg Emperor of Austria-Hungary at the time was Franz Joseph. He was forced to ask Metternich to resign and go into exile. Now, at the time, Metternich was elderly and tired, and he was not sorry to go. But Franz Joseph never forgot the experience. After the revolutions were finally suppressed, he took up Metternich's mantle of conservatism and zeal, anti-revolutionary zeal. For the rest of into the next century, he lived forever. He lived until 1916. France, the liberal constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe in France, which we covered previously, came into power in 1830, was overthrown by this revolution in 1848. The violence accompanying this 1848 revolution was deeply shocking to those born after the first revolution, but the older generation was not surprised because they saw all of it before. The violence included the Archbishop of Paris, Denis Auguste Affre, A-F-F-R-E, tried to intervene in the street fighting to stop it. He was shot down, along with thousands of others, including some of his own priests and acolytes who had gone investments in procession in the street to try to stop the fighting. They were just shot. This elected monarchy was replaced by the Second French Republic, which elected as its president Charles-Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a nephew of the real Napoleon Bonaparte. After Napoleon, the real Napoleon, was defeated in 1815, his son, his only son, went with his mother. Napoleon had married Marie-Louise, who was a Habsburg, went to live in Austria. For her sake, Napoleon's son was given an Austrian title, the Duke of Reichstag. But he died of tuberculosis in 1832. So then Napoleon's nephew, this guy, Charles Louis, took up the mantle of Bonapartism. 4 years after his election as president of the Second French Republic, Louis Napoleon carried out a coup d'etat to overthrow his own republic, replacing it with the Second French Empire, and proclaiming himself Emperor Napoleon III in 1852. That regnal number, third, was a fiction to maintain, the pretense that the Duke of Reichstag, the real Napoleon's son, had in fact reigned as Napoleon II. So this Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, declared that he wished to restore France to glory, so that his empire would be one of military power, but fueled by economic capitalism rather than managed mercantilism. As the years passed, it became clear that Louis Napoleon was a mediocre, unprincipled opportunist who had all of his uncle's ambitions but none of his ability. In the Papal States, the new Prime Minister, first and last, Prime Minister Count Pellegrino de Rossi, though personally agreeing with the Italian nationalists that the Austrians should be out of Italy, nevertheless, he remained loyal to the Holy Father, and he spent months meeting with the leaders of the different factions after Pius refused to wage war in Austria. Because of his long history as a political liberal, and because of the real governmental reforms that Pius had allowed, Rossi was succeeding in winning over the moderates of most factions to supporting the Holy Father's position of gradually negotiating Austrian withdrawal from Italy, or simply purchasing Austrian territory in Italy, rather than seeking the Risorgimento through violence. The Risorgimento is resurgence, the unification. But the radicals didn't want Rossi to succeed. They did not want a moderate negotiated solution. They wanted violence. So because of this, the radicals, the Carbonari, they regarded Rossi's successful diplomacy as a threat to their agenda. So they murdered him. He was stabbed to death on a public street on November 15th, 1848. There immediately followed, this was the trigger, planned, a carefully organized, prepared group of anarchists, posturing as a wild, spontaneous mob, surrounded the papal palace, started shooting through the windows all night. Chaos reigned in the city. But Pius IX initially was determined to remain. The next day, November 16th, 1848, one of the rounds fired in the palace hit and killed Bishop Palma, who was standing in the same room as the Pope. So it was time to go. With the help of the Bavarian ambassador to the Holy See, Count Charles de Spauer, the Swiss Guards smuggled Pius out of Rome in disguise on November 24th. He went south. He took refuge in Gaetano, which is in the Kingdom of Naples. He remained there in exile for 2 years. An atheist Roman Republic was then declared on February 9th, led by the two Giuseppes, Mazzini and Garibaldi. Predictably, as with all these revolutionary actions, there were atrocities, there were murders committed, including against priests and nuns in the Papal State. And once again, as it had been in the reign of the predecessor, Gregory XVI, this was only put down with troops sent by Catholic countries. But it took, they had to put down their own revolutions first. So it was not until April 12th, 1850, that Pius was able to return to Rome with the help of Austrian troops. And that's it. Pius changed. He was never the same after this. For the rest of his life, he remained deeply suspicious of all forms of liberalism, any mention of any kind of reform, because he had been betrayed. In his early part of his reign, he thought, okay, I'll give some moderate reforms, and that'll be enough. But then he was betrayed. So never again. He learned the hard way, the same lesson learned by Pius VII and Pius VI and Pius VII, that 19th century political liberalism was tainted with the anti-religious bigotry of 18th century rationalism. Pius IX never forgot the murder of Rossi or Bishop Palma or the violent anarchy spawned by mobs clamoring, or at least claiming to clamor, for democracy. 5 months Well, let me see how long we've been going. All right, yeah, we've been going. I don't want. So we'll pause here, and then we'll pick up with Pius in the post-revolutionary part of his reign. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.